Welcome, and thank you for joining me to learn more about the Missouri Department of Mental Health Division of Developmental Disabilities Utilization Review Process. My name is Wanda Crocker, and I am currently one of 3 Assistant Deputy Directors serving the Division of Developmental Disabilities, as well as supporting the utilization review process. The original training of this content was provided via web event on May 15, 2024, and included 5 major components: an overview of the utilization review memo that was effective May 1st, 2024, an overview of the utilization review process, a review of the critical criteria that meets the priority of need 5, resources that should be explored prior to the Medicaid waiver, and a handful of clarifications and reminders about service components that have surfaced in the last few months. As the May 15th web event experienced systems outage, which broke up the event and the recording had to be recreated, stakeholders expressed that it would be helpful to have the content divided into smaller content opportunities. This supports people listening and reviewing the content that best meets their needs initially and as refreshers are needed. This particular session, Utilization Review Part 3, reviews the critical service situation guidance found in Guideline 33. Let's go ahead and get started. The overarching principle in identification of a critical service situation is the inability of essential health and safety needs to be met by an individual's environment when no other reasonable alternative is available. Examples include homelessness, the death or incapacity of an individual's caregiver, or critical change in the medical behavioral needs of the individual. And we'll go through those in more detail as we walk through these slides. The division will also assign the highest priority to other specific situations based on legal obligations or interdivisional agreements. Acceptance and recognition of a critical service situation does not necessarily imply that the remedy proposed in the ISP must be accepted without modification. So what that is saying is that a critical service situation exists to show us the urgency of the need, not dictating which service best meets that need. It is the goal of the division to serve individuals in the least restrictive and most natural environment that can meet essential needs. So critical service situations that meet that legal or interdivisional agreement criteria in that first slide are a young adult aging out of MOKIDS, previously known as the Sarah Juan Lopez waiver, and the person needs the same level of care to maintain their well-being. When they reach the age limitation for that particular waiver and their care needs to continue, then they will transition into another waiver type. Olmstead is situations where individuals have the right to receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate to meet their needs. It's actually appropriate for everyone who is seeking community-based services. In the functional terms of Olmstead, we're talking about persons who are transitioning out of a rehabilitation center or nursing homes, and they have the highest priority in accessing waiver services so that they can access an integrated setting appropriate to their needs. And then we have a person who is currently in the care or custody of Children's Division, with whom the division has an interdivisional agreement, so the person can access the Medicaid waiver with funding from Children's Division, and that person is exiting that Children's Division custody due to aging out. Therefore, the interdivisional agreement ends, and the Division of Developmental Disabilities absorbs and picks up the funding that Children's Division was previously utilizing to support that child, who is now an adult. So where the critical service situations gets a little more subjective and difficult to define is the following slides that we're going to be reviewing. So the first one we're going to talk about is a situation that requires immediate life-sustaining intervention to prevent an unplanned hospitalization or residential placement. In these situations, the individual is at risk for serious physical harm or death if no intervention is provided. The focus must be on the capacity of the individual's environment to meet basic health and safety needs, including homelessness and lack of a caregiver. Example of homeless, we've provided several actually literally living on the streets, living in a homeless shelter, someone who is moving between households, between friends and family every couple of days or couple of weeks because they have no primary place of residence. No one will invite them to be a permanent resident of their home. That is what homeless is defined as. Homelessness is not a situation where a person lives with their parents and the parents are threatening to kick them out. The threat of homelessness does not meet the definition of homeless. Likewise, lack of a caregiver, a situation where that is appropriate is Wanda is residing with her 85-year-old grandmother who is entering into a nursing home next month. So in that situation, the person absolutely has no caregiver now to support them. That will meet critical service situation, but that's not a guarantee or an indicator that that person requires a residential service. That's an indicator that the person needs supports and services, and it's up to the planning team to look at what is the least restrictive environment that that needs to happen in. And hopefully in that situation, planning has been occurring for some time in anticipation of that caregiver not being able to provide services to that person. The explanation for this conclusion must clearly and persuasively be documented within the ISP. The documentation in the ISP must show the process, whoever is reviewing that critical service situation claim, that it meets this definition that leads to the reasonable expectation that without a service, life-sustaining intervention is needed or will result in an unplanned hospitalization or residential placement. So again, telling the story, providing the picture of the situation that clearly indicates to the reader that this is going to happen, and not just it's going to happen, but explain the situation that's led up to this. What is the clear situation or scenario or occurrences that have led to the statement that the person is at serious risk of physical harm or death if a service is not provided. If the current housing environment is not ideal but continues to provide for the basic physical needs of the individual, or if an alternative housing is available that could meet those needs, division-funded residential interventions would not be required. And even if that was true, say in the case of a caregiver, planning ahead of time, developing the resources while the caregiver is still capable, providing in-home services to offer training and preparation to provide that person with the best possibility of living on their own with supports in lieu of residential 24-hour supports is the best and most efficient plan for that person in hopes of meeting their maximum potential and life goals and dreams. Continuing on with life-sustaining intervention to prevent unplanned hospitalization or residential placement, there must be no other options, including standard Medicaid benefits, available that would reasonably be expected to provide appropriate levels of services and/or supervision. And if there is a credible risk of death or serious injury in the absence of waiver-funded services. So while state plan or Medicaid benefits does not have an equivalent of an individualized supported living or residential service, what that is speaking to is maybe it's a situation where the caregiver is temporarily out of the home, or there's a transition period occurring. Could the combination of standard Medicaid benefits and perhaps Medicaid waiver services that are not residential meet this need? This could include situations with the death or incapacity of a caregiver, results in need for immediate life-sustaining intervention. Could be used to prioritize individualized support plans that included either support or comprehensive waiver services, depending on the circumstances. Again, going back to It is not necessarily always a jump to residential services. Clearly explore all the services, clearly explain all the services that have been considered, and if they were already in place, what the results of those services were and why they're no longer appropriate or wouldn't be appropriate in this situation. Again, going back to clearly explaining the situation. Placement in an individualized support living or host home situation would be supportable only if there was documentation that this was the least restrictive environment and the alternative would be hospitalization. So the next example of a critical service situation would be when a person needs immediate services in order to protect themselves or someone else from immediate harm. So the plan needs to show that in the absence of protective intervention funded by the Division of DD's Medicaid waiver, immediate harm will occur or has already occurred and is likely to occur. Immediate harm is defined as significant injury that would require medical treatment and which is imminent without protective intervention. This means that there has been a pattern of significant harm such that required formal medical care to the individual or other persons. So need to be able to express and clearly show the reader that there has been a pattern, that it's formal medical care, not first aid applied at home, not the fear of something happening, but something has happened or leading to happen. For example, it's not uncommon to see grandma say, well, he hurt someone 5 years ago. I'm afraid he might hurt me now. What has happened in the last 6 months? What trend, what pattern, what harm, what medical care has occurred that's feeding these fears and making them truly meet this criteria of imminent protection of self or someone else from harm. What you're looking to document is the behaviors or incidents that have been documented within the last 6 months. This cannot apply to a single isolated event. Show the reader, express and show the pattern of events and the history in the last 6 months that is causing you to claim that immediate services are needed under this criteria. And remember that in cases of abuse or neglect, law enforcement and the Division of Health and Senior Services or Department of Social Services are the appropriate sources of remedy, or at least should be the avenue through which official channels are followed when there is allegations of abuse and neglect that fall under their purview or criminal activity. Those avenues should be followed, and the solution shouldn't just simply be to ask for Medicaid waiver services. If criminal activities or abuse and neglect is actually occurring, then people need to be held accountable for those activities. So when we look at a prioritization of need, which is a score assigned to a person seeking a Medicaid waiver slot, which indicates that there is a level of need that places the person on a waitlist process and determines when and how they're awarded services or a Medicaid waiver slot. Let's look at what that looks like. A prioritization of need is granted based on a 1 through 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. In order to obtain a prioritization of need score, a person has a Missouri Adaptive Assessment Scale performed where they are interviewed and observed, as well as an informant who knows the person well is asked to also report on the abilities and capabilities of the person. So the prioritization of need 1 through 4 is evaluated by the MAS based on the person's innate need for services. How much help do they need? How much support? What is their level? Is it hand over hand? Is it prompting? The more intense their need for supports, the higher that PON of 1 through 4. A person can never obtain that PON of 5 based on their innate needs for services. There is no means through the assessment to award a natural PON5. The only way a person can be granted that PON5 is through the critical criteria that we just went over in previous slides, as indicated by the Code of State Regulation. When the person is experiencing the assessment called the MOS, the support coordinator reports to the assessor that a critical criteria exists. They are claiming at face value that this critical service criteria exists, that they're homeless, that they're going to hurt someone, that they're at risk for imminent harm without services. The assessor or assessment team is going to take that claim at face value. There are a few questions in the assessment that ask to verify that, but they're not doing research. They're not reviewing the ISP. They're not looking at written justifications, patterns of events, evidence that this has happened within the last 6 months. Therefore, if the MOS generates that prioritization of need 5, that is an unverified allocation of a PON5. That PON5 will be verified through the utilization review process. So let's look at what that means. The utilization review process can only verify a prioritization of need 5 when evidence is presented meeting the critical criteria in the CSR. So that evidence that we went over in those first few slides, that the person is in need of immediate need of life-sustaining services, that there's immediate services needed in order to protect self or others from imminent physical harm, is evidenced by a pattern of events over the course of the last 6 months that resulted in physical harm resulting in medical attention, or the legalities of an Olmstead request, or a person who is aging out of an interdivisional agreement with Children's Division, or a person who is aging out of the Mo Kids waiver, or previously known as the Sarah Juan Lopez waiver. To be clear, being awarded a prioritization of need of 5 is not an indicator of any specific service. It is an indicator that a service is needed. A state plan must be reviewed if appropriate, and all natural supports must be accessed first. There needs to be an accounting of what has been tried and why it did not work. The planning team discusses which services will best meet the person's remaining unmet needs after state plan and natural supports. And in-home services should always be explored prior to residential services. What combination of in-home and community services could meet this person's need before residential services are ever explored? So again, PON5 is not an indicator for a specific service and is not a guarantee for a residential service. Whenever there is a claim or request for any services, all services are on the table to be explored to determine what's the best service for the person that can meet their needs in the least restrictive environment. So that is the end of section 3. I hope that has been helpful and provided you with some additional insights and thought trails to follow when you are requesting a service through the prioritization of need process, especially the critical service criteria. We will continue to develop training and resources to help support coordinators and planning teams develop the appropriate and comprehensive information necessary to express the critical service criteria. There are 3 other modules speaking to the utilization review process, and I encourage you to review those as necessary, and let us know if you can think of other criteria or components that would be beneficial to develop into training.